Welcome. In this video, I'm going to be giving you the 4 most important lessons from Yuval Noah Harari's book, Nexus, A Brief History of the Information Networks from the Stone Age to AI. And I'm going to be giving you these 4 lessons on some drawings here. The 4 major lessons. So the first is we're going to cover key dilemmas or trade-offs that civilizations have made over the course of history and the implications for information networks and the historical insights that come from that, because these are key to understanding how adding AI to the equation may change things in the future and is already changing things. The second is we're going to be looking at 3 different theories of information. We're going to be looking, and basically definitions. So we're going to be looking at Harari's definition. We're going to be looking at the populist definition, and we're going to be looking at the naive definition. And these are also really important for understanding the future of information networks and the future of AI. And the reason why information networks are central and information is central to all this is because the way Harari looks at civilizations and cultures is actually through the lens of centering data, centering information, and even questioning some of the, basically questioning humanism, the idea that the human is center, looking at organisms, whether they're humans or animals or computers, as just networks of information, different ways of organizing matter according to information, and modeling different organisms, organizations. They're all just different ways of forming matter together and representing information and information flows. So that's why it is a new paradigm, and that's part of what you get in the book. And it is also somewhat a continuation of what he talks about in Homo Deus, which means God man, or homo is man, and then deus is Latin for God. So then the third lesson has to do with totalitarian versus democratic governments and how they differ in terms of organization of information. We're also going to talk about a hybrid between the two and the sort of middle ground of the increasing power of the executive branch, strongman attacks on democracies that can turn them in a more totalitarian direction, basically threats to democracy. That's a significant part of the book. And also just understanding how the United States is a combination of these two. Just as an example, in emergencies and in times of war, the president is given additional powers. Additional power goes to the executive branch. Things like presidentialization, where more power flows to the top of the executive branch. So we're going to be talking about that. And then fourth is, what are the AI threats? He really focuses more on threats. If you're familiar with SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, it's 4 quadrants. He doesn't focus much on opportunities because he says that that's easy to get. That's in the news all the time. That's what all the companies are pushing with their marketing. They don't talk as much about the threats. So he really views it as his responsibility to focus mostly on the threats. So in terms of modeling that, we're going to talk about surveillance. That's one of his major concerns. We're going to talk about job automation. He talks about, for example, how Hitler rose to power democratically when there was a severe economic crisis and there was a huge amount of unemployment in Germany. So, and that links back to various totalitarian threats on democracy, and how to prevent those threats from taking over. And so job automation is a big piece of that, what to be worried about, what the most important skill is to protect yourself. And then finally, what are some other dangers? For example, how will totalitarian governments be affected by the increasing power of AI? And then finally, what are his policy recommendations? So we're going to be covering all of that in this video, so let's get into it. And we're going to start with the key dilemmas and trade-offs. The first one is he looks at how stories and bureaucracies are different ways of organizing people and organizing information networks. Because remember, the central idea with this whole book and with Harari's thought in general is really centering information as the core, sort of the ontological base, the atomic unit that everything else, and even getting into like quantum physics and little pieces, the theory that little pieces of information are at the bedrock of even material reality, not just informational reality. So stories are key for scaling up human society, but they're transmitted orally. Whereas bureaucracies, to scale up, they start using documents. And whether you have a story-based society where people are sharing stories, sharing experiences, sharing information embedded in stories, or they're building a bureaucratic structure, in both situations, Harari talks about the key two things all information networks and cultures are trying to do is they're trying to establish truth, but also order. And these are in tension because you have these myths and these stories that are the basis, sort of the axioms, the foundational facts of the culture that establish why things are the way they are, you know, creation story of how did things start, where do we come from, whether it's Genesis or the Big Bang or something else, flood. So those stories are really important for structuring society, how things should be, what the rules are, and what is the teleology, what is the end goal. So stories underlie all of that stuff and they provide order. But at the same time, they're in tension with truth, because what if you discover something that starts to call into question some of those stories, some of those myths? So, you know, Darwin's evolution was an example of that. That started to call into question Genesis and the creation story within Genesis. So there's this tension between order and truth. He also talks about bureaucracies and how bureaucracies, the foundational idea with them, they come from the French bureau. So a bureaucrat would sit next to a bureau with a bunch of drawers, and they'd fit their department or their sub-department, their office, and whatever area of reality that their department was in charge of would get fit into a bureau, and then various drawers, and then various subsections, basically file cabinets. So there's this idea that you can break up reality into these different categories, and then people can be specialized. This is also how academia is structured. The problem is, as you try to find more and more detailed truths through each one of these, you start to lose coherence at the larger level. And you can have things, you can have, you don't have somebody looking at the totality. You just have people looking at their individual little areas. So this is a really key thing, because this is part of the direction of development from basically an illiterate society to a literate society, and organizing things with a bureaucracy. The next thing he focuses on are holy books. And he talks about this in terms of infallibility. Basically, the problem is, in both of these situations, but especially in an illiterate society, you don't have a SSO, a single source of truth. And so the way societies have solved this problem is by creating holy books that bring together the canonical stories. And in the book, he talks about how the Jewish Bible was put together, how the Christian Bible was put together, how it was canonized. But he also talked about how you run into problems, or even after you choose a single thing that's going to be copied over and over again, everybody will have the same copy, and so therefore everybody sort of has access to the same ground truth, and you don't have as many disagreements about information and friction and wasted energy from that. You always have a priest class that is needed in order to interpret the holy book, because over time, as society changes, it becomes more and more difficult to interpret what was meant and how to handle edge cases and things that were never talked about in the holy book for the current situation. And so there was this attempt to get around human fallibility, people lying, people forgetting, people disagreeing about interpretation, hermeneutics. And there was this idea that, well, we can get rid of human fallibility by just settling on a holy book and sort of making it permanent and not changing it. But it turned out that didn't work. And so the solution to this is a self-correcting mechanism. You need to have self-correcting mechanisms in a society in order to prevent mistakes and prevent misinterpretation and correct for bad decision making, whoever and however those decisions are being made, whether by a totalitarian leader like Stalin, who makes many appearances in the book, or a democracy where people are voting and their representatives are making decisions and things are going back and forth. So this is a key idea, that you need to have self-correcting mechanisms. And he argues that having holy books and having sacred knowledge or sacred truths that can't be questioned or changed is very dangerous, because then there's no way to correct them. His fourth key dilemma and key trade-off is between centralized and distributed info networks. So you have your totalitarian and you have your democratic. And basically, there are efficiencies in having all information just flow to the top and then decisions flow down. Whereas in a democracy, things are more chaotic. There's a lot more different institutions and groups. They're all communicating with each other. But the thing is, with a totalitarian organization or centralized, you have one point of failure and you don't have these self-correcting mechanisms. Whereas with the democracy, because you have all of these decentralized, independent institutions checking each other, it's the basic idea of the checks on power, where the executive, legislative, and judicial branches all check each other's power, and then you also have the media involved in that as well. And so there's trade-offs, and part of why I brought up, which we'll talk about later, the rounded triangle, is because even democracies recognize the advantages of a centralized system, and they do centralize certain things at certain times. So The military is very centralized and has more of this top-down structure, but it has civilian control at the top. And in wartime and in emergencies like a pandemic or a hurricane or some other natural disaster, governments will temporarily shift into a more totalitarian mode. And I actually, if you watch my interview with Jonathan Alter, who wrote a book on FDR, he wrote about all the sort of more centralized, almost dictatorial powers FDR had during his tenure, which helped him win World War II, and how a lot of that is forgotten, but a lot of that infrastructure is still in place and makes our government susceptible to a strongman. So those are the 4 key dilemmas. Next, we're going to be talking about the 3 different views of information. So we have Harari's view. We have the populist. We have the naive view. So this is an area where I somewhat disagree with Harari, but I'm not going to get too much into that here. I'm going to be doing a separate video where I review the book. But basically, and it has to do with definitions and how Harari defines populist. And his definition is a little bit outside the mainstream. Like if you go on the populism on Wikipedia, it doesn't really agree with his definition. But the way he defines it is info is power, and all information and relationships are just power struggles. And he talks about how both on the left and on the right, these come into play. He talks about Foucault, he talks about Edward Said, how information has to do with power or knowledge power with Foucault, colonialism with Edward Said. And so both the left and the right have these populist energies and undercurrents, and they're both susceptible to this kind of stuff. My definition is different in the sense that I look at populism as more about class conflict and about the people fighting against a small cabal of elites, however they frame who the people are or who the majority are, and then who are this minority of elites that they're fighting against. And different people frame that differently. They look at different types of groups or classes, and so they define that conflict differently, or coalitions of classes or subclasses. Whereas Harari looks at it more of just anybody who frames things this way. And I think that's, it's not really a mainstream definition, and I don't think it's the most useful definition. Another way of looking at is about looking at this in terms of power struggles is, basically people on the left will talk about class war. People on the right might talk about a spiritual war. And so they may frame it differently, but both of them see it as a power struggle where information is a key part of that. And part of how populists solve this is, one way of doing it is with radical empiricism, captured by the phrase, do your own research. That's the idea, that is, you can't trust anybody else's testimony. You can't trust the testimony of a scientist or a quote unquote expert. You actually have to look through the microscope yourself. You can't trust anybody's word. Another is radical mysticism or intuitionism. This is the idea that you really can't trust anything external. You can only trust your intuition. And a key point he makes is that this makes people susceptible to charismatic leaders and strongmen. So charismatic leaders resonate on intuitive, sometimes even mystical or spiritual level. And because in reality, and Harari says this, you really can't do your own research. You can't just become an expert in everything, figure out everything yourself, because ultimately you can't trust even your own research because it's just too much to do. You fall into the only empirical method left is intuition and mysticism. Another thing Harari talks about with populism is that there's this idea of a mystical body. So everybody in the group, the majority, basically there's this idea that society is sort of like this. There's the elites, however they're defined, either monetarily or intellectually or whatever. And then there's the people. And he gets this definition of populism from a guy named Mueller, who there's a paper in the book that he links to that gets into this. But basically, he defines populism as this idea that somebody, a charismatic leader generally, talks about how they alone represent the people, and the people is this mystical body that the strong man represents. And that's how Mueller defines populism, and Harari uses that definition. So that's the populist view. And a key thing to understand, and a key thing he talks about, is how there's populism both on the left and on the right. Then he also talks about the naive view, and he never uses this term, but I think the best term is libertarian. It's basically a libertarian view. It's this idea that more info will just naturally lead to truth. There's this emergence, this idea, sort of like Adam Smith's The Invisible Hand. Good things or greed is good. Good things will naturally emerge out of chaos or out of disorganization. And it also has this definition of information, that information is material that is intended to lead to truth. And there's a famous court case where the term counter speech doctrine is used. And the idea is the solution to bad speech is more speech. There's also this idea that, and this is something that is actually shared between these two, is transparency. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And then finally, we have Harari's view. So his view is that most info is false, doesn't represent anything. He also specifically disagrees with this. He says, he actually said this in an interview, I don't think it's in the book, but he said, as you add more information, truth sinks to the bottom. It's expensive. Whereas fiction is cheap and simple. So part of the value of fiction, part of the value of stories, and he argues holy books as well, is that they oversimplify reality. That can lead to order, social order. That can be comforting to people, but they're comforting illusions. And it's part of why fiction can outcompete truth in a lot of situations. I think Mark Twain is the one who said, a falsehood will make its way halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on in the morning, or something like that. So he argues that truth is this very rare and valuable thing. You have to protect it, and you have to do a lot of things to make sure it comes out on top. It won't naturally win in a libertarian or anarchic situation. And that leads to some of his recommendations later on, as they have to do with, for example, social media companies taking more responsibility for what they publish, and especially what they amplify, and how he thinks about censorship. There's another thing which I kind of hinted at earlier, and he doesn't fully talk about it in the book. It's actually part of Homo Deus, but I just want to give you a brief understanding of it. And there's actually two pieces to it. So he talks about the change in conservative parties, and basically how conservative parties worldwide have become more revolutionary, whereas in the past, conservative parties in different countries have been more about less about policy and more about pace. They're generally just wanting to slow the pace of change, not radically reorganize society, whereas now that's much more what conservative parties are doing. And he calls himself somewhat of he says that his background as a historian has made him a Burkean conservative, which basically means that he's more wary of these often more leftist or progressive ideas of radically changing society, because he's seen how disastrous that's been across the course of history. So, and he feels that often revolutionaries or radicals don't realize how the changes they're making or the things they're fiddling around with are actually much more complicated than they realize, and that can lead to disastrous social consequences. So that's an interesting point he makes, but the bigger sort of theoretical thing is the different ideologies, and he goes into a lot of detail in Homo Deus, but basically he talks about different humanisms. You have liberal humanism, which is human rights, stuff like that. You have socialist humanism, which is sort of self-explanatory. You have evolutionary humanism, which has to do with evolutionary theory and how humans are progressing based on evolution, and humans can basically be modeled as creatures, evolutionary, just animals that are evolving. So evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, applying those theories. Socialist has to do with socialist man and the understanding of how man can be changed, or man's true nature, socialist man. And then he also talks about dataism, which is basically what I talked about earlier, where information is central. And you don't think about animals versus humans versus inanimate things. You think about information is the core ontological bedrock, and all material things are just different, are really these information objects. It's almost sort of like Plato's idea of the two levels, and the forms, and then how they're manifested in the lower physical reality. So you have dataism, and then you have transhumanism. So transhumanism has to do with how is humanity changing, cyborgs, Neuralink, brain implants, other types of implants, brain scanning. So basically, transhumanism is sort of a halfway house towards dataism. Dataism even gets into things like the Matrix movie and how people may upload themselves to the cloud. And what's more real, your digital self on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, or is your real self in the real world? So centering information, centering the virtual, centering data, that's sort of the furthest along the spectrum of all these different new ideologies. Next, we're going to look at Harari's thoughts on two different types of government organizations: totalitarian, democratic, and this intermediary shape, this rounded triangle. This rounded triangle is not something that he talks about. It's something that I'm adding in here because I think it's sort of the missing link. The other thing is the US is not a democracy, it's a democratic republic. And I think that just that distinction alone kind of explains the middle ground between these two ideals. And he even talks about this to an extent. Even totalitarian regimes are not as simple as they may seem, because the totalitarian leader at the very apex always has to rely on his underlings. And oftentimes it's the underling that betrays the totalitarian leader. And the totalitarian leader has a lot of dependency on their underlings. So it's not quite as simple as it may seem. And in democracies, there are still these hierarchies, but there's more decentralization. So you have central information flow. You have basically two problems: collecting info and then analyzing info. And totalitarian regimes in the past have been pretty good at collecting information. Their problem has often been being able to analyze it. They just don't have enough people, manpower, time, computers to be able to analyze all the information and make high quality decisions. And if you look at a lot of the critiques of the totalitarian sort of command economies in the past has been that they're not able to process information in the way that a free market can process information. But with AI, that's now coming into question. It's not something he talks about as much. That's more something I'm adding to it. He does talk about these things, but in terms of a market being the only solution to be able to analyze and properly allocate resources versus a decentralized free market, that's one of the issues, and that's how it plays into this collection versus analysis of information. You also have motivation issues. When people are part of a totalitarian system, they often lack motivation, whereas in a democratic system and a free market system, they have more motivation. And he talks about how there's a lot of issues with motivation, fear, and loathing. And he especially focuses on the USSR and just all the information network related issues that existed in that civilization. He also talks about the Catholic Church quite a bit and the witch hunts. And basically how the witch hunts were part of this larger problem where even with the printing press, you still had issues where false stories about witches and books that weren't about science, but were about all this fake stuff or sensational stuff were much more popular and were bestsellers whereas scientific books were not bestsellers. So the true effect of things like the printing press is not as simple as it may seem in hindsight. You also have the story of the kulaks, who were the more successful farmers, more successful peasants in each town, and they were systematically exterminated because they were seen as going against the collective farms and causing problems with the totalitarian command economy. Then you have the democratic side. So you have distributed institutions. And the three big ones are media, judiciary. Those are really the big two. And then you have academia as the third. You also have NGOs. You also have governments. And at the state and local level, you also have private business. But he really focuses on the big three, and he talks about how a strong man can take over by attacking these two things. So attacking the media and attacking the judiciary. And what happens is when the strong man attacks the media, he can discredit anybody, and he can basically just control what people believe via what's on the front page and what stories are covered and which ones aren't. He talks about how Mussolini and Stalin or Lenin, I'm actually blanking on which one, I think it's Lenin actually, but they were both editors of newspapers who were deciding what's going to be the front page story every day before they became dictators. So media is extremely important. That's one of the, talking about fake news and just destroying the credibility of media. That's one way to do it, and also taking over the media. Then you have the judiciary. So you have lawfare, you have putting opponents in jail, you have attacking your enemies, whether they're businesses or them as individuals or their organizations, attacking them with the judiciary, taking out judges or taking out influencing prosecutors, just influencing every part of the judiciary. And then you also have academics. So who's allowed to be a professor? What are they allowed to teach? What kind of chilling effects exist? Who gets promoted? Who's put in charge of various things? So once these are attacked, everything else falls into place. And so strongmen always go after media and judiciary in particular. And he makes a point of that. You also have self-correcting mechanisms. So all of these different types of institutions all correct each other and give a democratic society the ability to fix mistakes and over time make better and better decisions. And then finally, you have this middle ground. So one of the key, going back to the beginning of the US, you have the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. So you have, or the Democratic Republicans. So Jefferson was more in favor of states with a fairly weak central government, more decentralized. Hamilton was a Federalist, wanted a stronger central government. And this was a tension back and forth over the size of the central government, what it should have the power to do. And you also have more recent theories about things like wartime powers, presidentialization. I teach a course on the presidency where we talk more about this unitary executive theory, executive orders, signing statements, interpretation of laws. So sending out letters or sending out, telling the executive branch, we're going to interpret this law in this way. And the administrative or deep state. Harari also talks about the deep state specifically in the book. Wartime emergency and also emergency powers. During the pandemic, for example, the president has the ability to go into companies and basically take them over. Same thing as in wartime. The president can take over a company and basically put it to use in order to solve the emergency or to prepare the country for wartime. And what that emergency power ends up allowing the president to do is usually they don't have to take over the business, because the CEO will meet with the president and they'll basically come to an agreement where the government doesn't have to fully take it over. They just tell the company, hey, here's what you need to do. And the company is incentivized to do that so that they don't get taken over. Now, the fourth part is AI threats. So we have job automation. We have surveillance. We have action. And we have other dangers. And because there's so much in this specific drawing, I'm actually going to be using a slightly finer pen so that we can fit everything in here. So this whole Orwellian surveillance or totalitarian surveillance system, sometimes called, it can be totalitarian, but it can also, he also talks about surveillance capitalism, where their surveillance is a little bit more decentralized, but it's surveillance nonetheless. So the first thing is requiring, his first recommendation is we need to require benevolence. One way to do this is to get rid of free models, change the business model. And like the EU is doing this with Facebook, where people have the option to pay for Facebook instead of being shown ads. So get rid of free models where you're paying with your information, you're paying with your privacy. Second option is socialize. So certain things are seen as so important, like the military, the police, the firefighters, that those things are socialized. And so maybe Elon's always talking about Twitter as being the world's town square. Maybe some of these information town squares or meeting places are so important, they should be socialized and no private company should be controlling them. And then a third thing is don't merge databases. So the police have a database, the IRS has a database, your doctor or the healthcare system has a database. Companies have databases on how you spend money. Your bank has a database. Credit cards have a database. Those all contain private information, and those should not be merged together. Those should all be kept separate. That actually links to point 2, which is decentralize. So you need to have decentralization of institutions in order to have self-correcting mechanisms. And I already gave you the list of institutions in the previous slide, but they need to maintain decentralization. And part of that is also like with media is, he didn't say this, but I just want to add this very briefly, is avoiding conglomerates. And some of the stuff that I think the FTC is doing in terms of breaking up monopolies. Number 3 is mutualism. So it shouldn't just be big organizations and governments doing top down. It should be bottom up as well. So pair top down surveillance with bottom up surveillance. So there should be transparency, especially about like algorithms and business models. How are big companies making money? What are their algorithms doing? And then 4 is change and rest. You should be able to change. And this is where he gets into the basically a spectrum between no change and change everything. So on the no change end, he gives the example of the Hindu caste system, where you're not able to change, or just being stuck with a permanent record, basically, where you can't change because there's all this data about you. The flip side is changing everything. He talks about the USSR and their belief in radical change and changing human nature, or really questioning what is human nature and changing it more than anybody thought possible. So you should be able to change. The right to be forgotten is something that's big in the EU, not so much in the US. And then also rest. You should be able to escape AI. You shouldn't be being surveilled 24/7. There needs to be an escape. Next thing we'll talk about is job automation and the 5 key things that are sort of counterintuitive. The first one is the pace of change is increasing. And this is a really big problem, because he talks about how the Nazis rose to power, and it was because there was high unemployment, 25% unemployment, and there was this desperation. And so when people can't keep up with change, when things become worse and worse, they look for more and more radical solutions. And people are going to have a tougher and tougher time keeping up as things change more and more. Number 2 is people often assume intellectual skills are harder to automate versus social and emotional. And it turns out that that's not true. Intellectual skills are often significantly easier to automate than social and emotional. And he gives the example of how there's certain roles that doctors do, like a radiologist who analyzes various images to determine if there's cancer or not, or a tumor or not. And computers are beginning to be able to do that better than humans can. Whereas nurses who provide and do more social and emotional work, their jobs are safer from automation. So sort of a counterintuitive thing, especially in terms of what's valued more, because doctors are valued a lot more than nurses are in terms of pay. Next is creativity. People assume that computers can't be creative, and that is also not true. And we're seeing with ChatGPT and these image generation tools, we're seeing the beginnings of that. But people just have this built-in assumption that's outdated, that computers can't be creative. And so they think that's going to protect them. Number 4 is people believe that computers can't have a emotional intelligence. And he shows an interesting study where human patients rated a ChatGPT type medical advisor as giving more empathetic advice than human doctors who were using this chat service to ask a doctor questions. And then number 5, and related to this, is that AI is actually superhumanly good at reading our emotions and figuring out what influences us at an emotional level. And this is very useful for marketing and propaganda. And then the 5th point is one of the safest areas for humans is where the relationship is more of the value than problem solving, or the information you're getting. And he gives the example of a priest and an athlete or entertainer. And then he says the most important skill is flexibility, and that relates to this first point. So he says remaining flexible. And the way I interpret this is making sure that you're updating your understanding of reality and updating your plans more frequently than you're used to doing, because things are changing faster. And then also building evergreen skills that are valuable across a wide range of different occupations. And then finally, we're going to talk about, or actually we're going to talk about actions last, but we're also going to talk about some of the other dangers he mentioned. And the reason I put these into one category is because they are jumbled around a little bit, and he doesn't maintain a strict organizational structure for this section of the book. This first one is about totalitarian systems, and one of the dangers with totalitarian systems is that a dictator can become a puppet to an AI. And earlier on in the historical parts of the book, he talks about how historically dictators, totalitarian leaders have been dependent on their underlings, and that's often been the cause of their demise. And sometimes they've been controlled by one of their key underlings. Somebody who's at the nexus of the information flow. And that's part of his big overall theory. And the danger of AI is that until AI, you only had humans connecting to other humans, and a document was an intermediary, or a clay tablet or a video recording was an intermediary between humans. But now we're entering this new era where you have an AI, and it can directly relate to other AIs as well as humans. And AIs can be part of their own network without humans being involved. So they're not just artifacts that are reliant on humans to be part of the information network. They can actually be part of the network without humans being involved. And sometimes you don't even know if they're a bot or they're a human. And one of his recommendations is that bots don't have freedom of speech, and bots need to be transparent, and they can't be allowed to take over information networks. Number 2 is the danger of escalation, especially with cyber war. Because basically with nukes, you had MAD, mutually assured destruction. Whereas with cyber war, nobody really knows what the red lines are that you can't cross, or what counts as escalation, or what is the proper response to something. And so cyber war, just over the last 5, 10, 20, whatever number of years, has been steadily escalating, and nobody knows what to do about it. And when you add AI to this equation, one of the things that's considered the most dangerous situation with nukes is when you have a leading power, meaning they have the best technology or the most power, but they feel they're about to lose it. That's when they're most likely to use nuclear weapons to prevent that from happening. And so when you add AI into the equation, it just becomes more dangerous, because AI can be seen as this threat where if you're starting to lose your AI advantage, then that could be the time to attack before you lose that permanently. Third is terrorists using AI to create a bioweapon, sometimes referred to as empowered individuals, which is a more broad term that just talks about how individuals, with part of what technology does is it makes individuals more and more powerful, and therefore more and more dangerous. And that therefore requires more surveillance, more control, because individuals used to not be that dangerous. They didn't need to be watched that closely or controlled that tightly. But as people become more powerful and more dangerous, things have to tighten more and more. Number 4 is the mind-body split. And I thought this was one of the most interesting aspects and predictions of the entire book. He goes through the history of Judaism and Christianity and how they've dealt with this mind-body problem, where originally Judaism and early Christianity were much more focused on the body and people being embodied and not having this separation between body and mind or body and soul. It was all part of one package. And then over time, it became more and more popular to imagine an immaterial self that in some ways could be disconnected from the dirty material body. And what we're seeing now is with the metaverse, Second Life, and things like that, and social media and Instagram, people putting more of their time and energy into their digital self rather than their material self. So he imagines a world potentially separated by a silicon curtain, where one civilization values the mind and virtuality more and lives in a kingdom of God in the metaverse, and sort of uploads their mind to the metaverse, and sort of like the Matrix movie, leaves the material world behind. And then the other civilization values the body more, and the digital world remains a side show. It remains an auxiliary thing, but not the main reality that people live in. And he just imagines what kind of conflict could exist where you have people living in such different realities. The 5th thing he talks about is data colonialism. He talks about how in previous colonialisms, you had the value of land was very important for agriculture. Then in the Industrial Revolution, machines were very valuable, and raw materials were very valuable to then be processed. But those raw materials and machines could be moved around, whereas you can't move around land. And now in the information age, data is becoming the most valuable resource, and data can be moved around effortlessly, very cheaply, and can be concentrated in a very small space. And big companies and countries are, like China with their very advanced AI, and they have much less privacy. So their AI in some senses is much more advanced in terms of how they control society and citizens' behavior. They have a social credit score. So in that way, they've become much more advanced than the West in terms of that use case for AI. And countries have been, the US banning TikTok, China banning most of the US major social media companies from China and having their own systems, the Great Firewall. Countries are being more, and the recent arrest of the Telegram founder and all the just conflict around apps and who has data, who has access to data, Bitcoin, and these digital currencies and digital second layer and third layer technologies. So at the civilizational level and at the country level, controlling your own data, controlling your citizens' data, not giving other countries power over your citizens' data or their information or their access to critical apps. So, can the US just shut down? Let's say the US could shut down Microsoft Word for everybody in China if they wanted to. Then China would have to respond by using some other software or Google Docs or whatever. So whatever, with all these SaaS companies and reliance on cloud computing that you don't own, that you don't control, there's a lot of vulnerability there. You even see with which companies can buy NVIDIA cards that can run their AI tools. You have conflict over that and trying to buy that stuff up very quickly. And then number 6 is AI alignment. He talks about Clausewitz and this idea of war is policy by other means, but the problem with that is that you can't rationally express your summum bonum, your highest good. What is the highest good? What is the goal that the AI should be aligned around? What is the goal of the civilization? And when you have a diversity of cultures and perspectives on that, how do they come together to define what the AI should be aligned with? This isn't really a new problem. You have in capitalism, you have companies that are driven by profit. And so they create externalities like pollution and other things, other damage, Facebook and these other companies damaging kids with their addictive algorithms and all the various stuff that they're doing. And I'm going to be doing a video on, blanking on that guy's name, but he just did the big book on this problem. Jonathan Haidt just did a book on this. So that's an example of AI alignment. But anytime you have an individual or a group, it's not necessarily aligned with the summum bonum, the highest good of the society. And so as you give AIs more decision-making power, they're going to have more and more of an effect on the overall good of the society. And so how do you make sure that they're regulated properly? The same way companies and other organizations and individuals are motivated and regulated to work towards the highest good. AIs also need to be regulated in the same way. So that brings us to the final area. What kind of action should be taken? He does believe in sort of a limited, he doesn't say it in this way, but I paraphrase it as censorship. He does believe that there needs to be a certain level of control of information, like banning bots. He believes no Section 230, which is basically immunity for social media companies. He believes in pushing truth and rebuilding trust in institutions. he says that there should be no infallible sources of information. And that links to the final thing, which is building strong self-correcting mechanisms in institutions so that they are pursuing truth and pushing out truth. So censorship can be thought of as reducing the amount of falsehood that's out there, and pushing truth is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum of making sure that more true information gets put into the public square and gets put into people's feeds, and making companies responsible for banning bots or limiting them or labeling them, not allowing them to participate and pollute information networks, and giving companies responsibility where they can be sued or they can be punished by regulators for not taking appropriate action to limit toxic information or untrue information and fact-checking things. So he basically sees these algorithms as replacements of human editors of newspapers, and he views the companies as needing to take similar kind of responsibility as a newspaper editor for determining which stories should be put at the top and what people should be paying attention to, and not allowing AI to just take that over. It needs to have human intervention. So those are the big ideas and the big lessons of Yuval Noah Harari's book, Nexus. If you want a PDF of all of these notes, you can find that PDF in a link down in the description. Make sure you like and subscribe to this video if you want to get more content like this. I'm also going to be doing a summary of the book, chapter by chapter, as well as a review of the book where I get more into how does it link to other books. I'm probably going to be doing a video like this as well on his other two books, Sapiens and Homo Deus. And let me know in the comments what you think, what you agree with, what you disagree with, if you want to get more content like this. And if you're interested in any of my courses, sign up for my newsletter. You can reach out to me at support@timothykenny.com if you want to learn more about any of my courses. There'll be links down below. But I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.